All right, so we're going to talk about the 1950s Red Scare. So this is different from the 1920s Red Scare, but they're both about the fear of communism. So our starting date here, even though it's associated with the 1950s, it kind of begins in the late 1940s, in 1947, with the House Un-American Activities Committee, that's Hugh Act, that investigated communists in government and other places. And one of the things that they were kind of famous for was investigating Hollywood writers and producers and actors of being communists for their associations going back to the 1930s. And so there were some of these writers and producers refused to cooperate. We'll talk about them and the contradictory characteristics later. And the end date is 1954, when there were Senate hearings that were actually investigating kind of Joseph McCarthy and his tactics, and these were televised. So this is really one of the first impacts of television on politics, and it exposed kind of McCarthy as this bully who was using kind of like shady methods to try and uncover quote unquote communists in the government. Okay, so the 1950s Red Scare. So one of the things that's important to think about is there were some failures against communism that was happening in the late 1940s, early 1950s. So, for example, in Eastern Europe, you had Stalin had taken over Eastern Europe and had promised elections but had not followed through. So Eastern Europe had kind of become communist. China had also become communist. You had the Chinese kind of revolution with Mao Zedong. And so you have China was a huge country. So now you have Russia, the Soviet Union, and China that are communist. You have Eastern Europe that's communist. And the Soviet Union also get their atomic weapons. So it looked like, at the end of World War II, the United States had a big lead over everybody else. The United States is the most powerful economic country, the most powerful military country. And then all of a sudden, all these things kind of happen. So there's a fear that the United States is kind of falling behind against communism. So Truman, under pressure, he initiates the federal loyalty program. And he did this because he didn't want to appear being soft on communism, especially considering like he was in charge when all these things were happening and communism was advancing. So he didn't want to be seen as soft on communism. So he set this federal loyalty program where federal employees would have to take a loyalty oath to the United States and the Constitution and promise they were not communists. The Republicans, the other party, so Truman's a Democrat, the Republicans, they take this soft on communism label and they kind of run with it. And they pass a law, the McCarthyism Act, where communists have to register with the government. Now, remember, communism is a political belief, so is that really kind of an American ideal to have people register with the government because of their political beliefs? That's a question people had. But also, communism was really unpopular. So Hugh Act, I mentioned, they were accusing Hollywood and others of being communists, saying that communists were kind of in everyday lives. It wasn't just government. Then we have their accusations against Alger Hiss. He was accused of giving classified information to the Soviets. He was a government employee in the State Department, and he was, accused of being a communist sympathizer and giving classified information, secret information to the Soviets, basically spying for the Soviet Union. And then you have the Rosenbergs, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They were a married couple. They were actually sentenced to death for passing atomic secrets to help the Soviet Union get the atomic weapons. And so that was seen as a really bad thing to be doing to help the communists in that way. The biggest thing about the 50s Red Scare was McCarthyism. And Joseph McCarthy, he's a Republican Wisconsin senator. He would accuse government officials of being communists. He said he had a list, but he had no actual evidence of it. He never provided the evidence. He said, I have in my hand a list of 205 communist members working for the government. He was very aggressive in his tactics. He would kind of bully people. He used intimidation tactics. And Eisenhower, the president at the time, refused to criticize McCarthy. So Eisenhower's silence kind of gave approval to McCarthy a little bit in some ways. But then what ended up happening is these TV hearings showed the Senate investigating McCarthy and his tactics later on. And the famous quote is, "Have you no decency, sir?" Kind of exposed McCarthy's cruelty by his tactics. Okay, so at this time you have our contradictory characteristics. So Truman vetoed the McCarthyism Act, which was the law that communists must register with the government.